and welcome to the Awake, Smoky and Hot forum. My name is Tanya Ha. I'm a science journalist and sustainability researcher, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's forum. The Awake, Smoky and Hot forum is part of a suite of forums that are being held as part of the Bushfire CRC Research to Drive Change project. Now, a brief overview of today's forum. The focus is on the impacts of sleep deprivation, smoke and heat exposure on firefighters. We'll soon start with an introductory video, followed by 4 research presentations and a discussion with a lead end user. And along the way, there'll be online polls and opportunities for discussion and questions. Now, having 4 research presentations, we will be tight on time, but we'll endeavour to have those finished by 1:30. However, I do encourage you to stay online to hear from our lead end user, because that role is very important with the research that's being covered today. Now, for those of you who are new to this online platform, I'll quickly introduce you to this environment. The main part is self-explanatory. The presenter slideshows and the polls will appear in the middle of the main section on the screen that you see. The presenters will appear on the right-hand side of the screen, as you can see, via webcam. But I'd also like to direct your attention to the left-hand side of the screen, where you'll see the presenters' names, but underneath that there is a dialogue box. That bottom left-hand side, the small window with a speech bubble at its left corner, is the place where you can type in your questions and comments as the researchers present their work. Now, one thing to note is that our voices are coming via phone lines. The vision that you see is coming via the internet. Now, this is done for optimal clarity and bandwidth, but it does mean that what you see and what you hear can be a little bit out of sync. Now, that's not a problem, it's just one of the technical limitations that we have with the technology we're using. But if anyone is experiencing technical difficulties, they can contact the hotline on 1-800-733-416. That's 1-800-733-416, and tech support will assist. Now, the forum today will be recorded and will be available at a later date on the Bushfire CRC website in a few days' time. So if you have colleagues that you think would be interested in what you hear about today, do encourage them to revisit the website at a later date. Our last Research to Drive Change forum on the impacts of fire on water and carbon in landscapes is also online now. Now, thank you to those of you who've already sent through questions for the presenters. They'll be addressed during today's proceedings. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have joining us Dr. Brad Aisbett from Deakin University, Professor Sally Ferguson from CQ University, Dr. Fabienne Reisen from CSIRO, Dr. Michelle Short from the University of South Australia, and Robyn Pearce, the lead end user from Tasmania Fire Service. But we'll hear from them more shortly. First, we have a poll question. How much do you think you understand about fire ground stresses on firefighters, such as smoke, sleep disruption and heat? Now, click on the answer just to give us an indication of what you feel you know about today's subject matter. And we'll give it a few seconds more. That's interesting. Quite a few know a fair bit. And we'll leave the poll there. We'll see if that changes during the course of today's presentations. But to kick things off, we're first going to see a video that summarises the research that we're going to hear about today. You'll also hear from the people that are going to be presenting their research as part of today's proceedings.
It originally came up when the original Bushfire CRC was being created. And the industry had been doing some work around that time looking at fatigue management and fatigue management guidelines. And we were focusing on fatigue management purely as being a shift length issue. And it created quite a bit of consternation around the industry because what we were ignorant of at that stage was the impact of sleep duration, hydration, nutrition, all of those factors and how that actually goes to impact upon fatigue. So we started having some conversations at that time in the context of the bushfire CRC about what research could be done to assist us with answering those questions.
A number of senior occupational health and safety managers expressed their concern that researchers would present robust but isolated guidelines that didn't speak to other guidelines. So their challenge to our research team and others was to develop an integrated approach to this problem rather than a series of isolated or siloed research outcomes.
So the work that we do here at the Appleton Institute is largely focused on understanding what happens to people when they don't get enough sleep. So if we think about cognitive ability on the fire ground as being about concentrating, vigilance, and then responding appropriately, what's important is that our firefighters are picking up the signals that they need to make the right decisions to keep themselves safe.
In the simulation, we had 91 firefighters perform 3 days of simulated work in various temperature conditions or lengths of time. The base for all of the testing included 3 days of a circuit of physically demanding tasks that firefighters had already identified that these were the core tasks on the fire ground. Hose dragging, stepping over obstacles while moving a hose from one position to another, raking up debris, the stop-start movements that are fundamental to a clean-up operation, and then statically holding a hose in position while you deliver charged water onto a fire front or burning debris.
So they did physical tasks, then we took some physiological measures, some blood draws and some blood pressure and those sorts of things, and then they did a battery of cognitive tasks. And they did this block of physical, physiological and cognitive 5 times across the day, interspersed with some hydration breaks, meals, etc. At night time, we kitted them out with electrodes to measure their sleep and lined them up on their camp stretchers, and they slept in the classroom as well to mimic sleeping on a deployment in a tent or wherever they do.
Through the simulation, we found that 2 days of restricted sleep, where firefighters only had 3.5 hours of sleep on average, did not impair their physical work. It had significant drops in their mental performance. It also increased their stress or their cortisol response beyond that of normal waking levels. But their physical work was maintained. What this tells us is that firefighters were able to pace their efforts, even though they were sleep fatigued, to maintain their physical work output across their shifts.
The big finding here is the changes in cognitive performance, the lack of change in physical performance, and how we, or agencies, then use that information to design practices that protect people on the fire ground. That is, you've worked this long, you didn't get any sleep, we need to give you a rest, even though you might feel okay.
For the study that we've been running, the focus is really for incident management teams. So it's for those people who have a greater cognitive load associated with their work, and also that the logistics around those groups of people are different for the firefighters. So the sleep laboratory is a temperature controlled and also light controlled environment. So basically we were just looking at novel ways. So obviously in many industries they use 8-hour rosters, but that involves needing 3 rotations of people. And obviously when you have a bushfire emergency you need as many hands on deck for as much as the time as possible. So we really wanted to say, if we've only got 2 crews of workers, how can we manage that in ways that might address the risk. And the centre also has 4 individual bedrooms, and these were used both to do the cognitive testing and also this was where participants were wired up so that we could monitor their sleep. One thing that we found that was quite striking with the work that had been done previously is a lot of the timing of shifts had always been done in a particular way with no evidence base that we could discern apart from it had always been done in this way. So we were wanting to really look at not just having these shorter, more frequent shifts, but also what's the best timing for them, considering everything that we know about the body clock and the effect that has.
We had previously done research on exposures of firefighters at prescribed burns and bushfires, but then we realised once fires sort of extend into urbanised areas, which happen more and more frequently, we don't have a very good understanding of what the additional exposure risk might be to firefighters. Once you reach sort of urbanised areas, you have additional fuels that's available, so you've got structures that are burning, and the plastics or polymeric materials that's in those structures, they release additional toxic elements. So actually the smoke itself becomes more toxic, and also the yields of the emissions might be much higher. So the way we approached it this time, rather than putting personal monitors on firefighters, is using a newly developed smoke dispersion model, where we basically put the emissions into that and translated those emissions into exposures downwind. Once you have the exposure estimates, we did similar to what we did with the other project, comparing them to occupational exposure standards and see within the mixture of pollutants what the likely health impacts would be. So some of it, like for example carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, you would have asphyxiants, so they could impact on your decision making. So that's usually if you're very close to the source. But further away, it's probably like particulate matter and other irritants, that's probably still going to be an issue. In a sense, I think the research really provided us with a better understanding of what firefighters are exposed to, what the potential health risks are. And I think it's a really important point to highlight, especially during training firefighters, to make them aware of what different smoke components can do to their body, and so that they can recognise sort of the symptoms. But the other thing that we're trying to work on too, it's rather moving a bit away from the firefighters, but it might also provide some information for residents who are sort of trapped in their homes, and make them aware too of what they can expect if there's smoke, because often when you're looking at people, often people say, yeah, I'm always like, I could barely breathe, I could barely see, so it gives them additional information, and I think this project would be really interesting to sort of put that into the context of residents as well and community exposures.
Our work practices have been designed based upon a lot of experience over a lot of years, and I think there's a lot of innate knowledge that people have built into it. But what we haven't had is the science, so that when we see people saying how tired they are because they haven't been able to sleep properly in the accommodation that they've had, we haven't actually been able to unpack, well, what does that really mean for us? So it's giving us the opportunity to answer some of those questions so that we know where to target the work that we need to do, and where do we target our education more than anything else, because things like fatigue and hydration and nutrition are not well understood.
And thank you to the Bushfire CRC for that video. If anyone had trouble viewing it, it can be viewed later on the Bushfire CRC website. But you did hear from all of the researchers that will be presenting today. And I think one of the important points that came through from that video is that the simulations found that although firefighters may have felt physically okay, although their physical capabilities didn't necessarily decline, their cognitive abilities did decline more than expected. So what that means in lay terms is that someone can be feeling okay. They can physically feel like they're up to another shift, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're thinking that their cognitive ability is up to that. And it's these considerations we need to factor into our planning. Now we're going to hear from our researchers. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first research presentation. We're now going to hear from Dr. Brad Aisbett. He's from the Centre for Physical Activity and Nutrition Research at Deakin University, and he's going to present on operational readiness of rural firefighters during bushfire suppression. And again, to the audience, we encourage you to send through your comments or questions via the dialogue chat box that's at the bottom left hand of the screen. Take it away, Brad.
Thanks, Tanya. Pictures like this are becoming all too familiar over the last decade. In most continents on Earth, there's been major fire events with intense smoke and heat. But what we're also starting to see is more and more examples of the human toll of fighting these fires. And here's a picture of 3 firefighters during a recent Australian bushfire catching up on some sleep by the roadside between shifts. And I want to highlight this to point out that fire agencies and their firefighters aren't just battling smoke or intense hot weather, but they're also battling long hours and shortened sleep when they work to curtail the spread of fire. Now, as scientists, we can advise agencies on policies and practices around the stresses that their workers face. For instance, we know that hot temperatures can slow exercise and sporting performance. However, most of the research that gets done in the world of heat and exercise is performed by well-rested athletes performing cycling or running tasks lasting 30 seconds up to 2.5 hours in well-ventilated laboratories wearing light athletic gear. Not quite the proxy of a 10-hour fireground shift wearing personal protective clothing out in the elements and away from perhaps clean air, fluids, etc. We also know that long working hours and shortened sleep can slow mental performance. But in the vast majority of research that's been done on fatigue and cognitive or mental tasks, these tasks have been performed in quiet environments and haven't been preceded by intense physical work such as we see on the fireground. So we wanted to ask the question, how does the previous research relate to our fireground environment? And specifically, how does hot temperatures and or shortened sleep impact on real firefighting tasks? So this brings me to 4 of our research outcomes, and Professor Sally Ferguson will talk about more of them from our project. And I encourage you to read the online report as well. Our first task, or our first step, and really an outcome in of its own right, was to design a laboratory simulation of the fireground, where as researchers we could control the heat, the amount of sleep the firefighters were getting, how much food and fluid they had access to, the type of work that they were doing, what sort of ration packs they had access to. But it did so in a way that still resonated with our firefighters, so that any findings that we found in this work could be easily transferred to the fireground and put into practice. And to do this novel approach took 12 months of partnership with our agencies and our end users, where we would design and develop components of our simulation and then take it back to members of the Australasian Fire and Emergency Services Authority for their review, for their refinement, and for their evaluation. And only when we received positive evaluations on all the components could we feel assured that the work we were producing could actually make a difference on the fireground and be readily transferred. So that brings me to our second finding in our hot conditions. And as it says here, firefighters can maintain their physical work performance in their first shift in hot conditions. And here we found that there was no difference in firefighters' physical work when they were dragging or rolling hoses, holding them for sustained periods, raking debris or manoeuvring around obstacles. Over 6 hours of intermittent work in either 18 degrees or 33 degree temperatures. This was a departure from some of the previous research in sport and exercise, but what we think may explain the lack of difference between the two conditions was that firefighters, in anticipation for the hot conditions and during their work in the hot environment, doubled their fluid intake. And it may be that this increase and preparatory increase in fluid intake offset any heat stress so that they could actually sustain their work just as they could in more cooler conditions. In our third finding, you can see that firefighters can maintain their physical work despite only gaining 4 hours sleep between shifts, and Tanya alluded to this earlier from the video. And in this finding, we found that there was no difference when firefighters were working 2 10-hour shifts separated between by only as little as 4 hours sleep opportunity in one condition, or when they had a full 8 hours sleep opportunity in the other. And what we think may occur here is that the tasks we were performing were so frequently rotated, just as they are in the fireground, and so inherently interesting and relevant to the firefighters that we had performing the task, that combination of high rotation and high interest offset some of the fatigue that they may have been feeling from their shortened sleep. We repeated that experiment looking at hot conditions and looking at shortened sleep in 18 degree temperatures versus when they were working in 33-degree temperatures. And again, we found that firefighters were able to maintain their work performance in hot temperatures with shortened sleep across 2 consecutive shifts. It might be, again, that the combination of the fireground environment that we simulated and was positively reviewed by the agency, where firefighters have free access to food and fluids to offset any heat stress, and then do inherently important and stimulating tasks with frequent breaks, allows them to preserve their energy and pace themselves in 18 degrees and in 33-degree temperature. For more findings, I'm going to hand back to Tanya, and she'll hand over to Sally Ferguson for another part of our research from the Operational Readiness Program. Back to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Brad. We've already got some questions coming through. Just very quickly, Serafina has asked, most shifts are 12 hours. Did you study that or just 10-hour shift length?
Thanks, Serafina. The work bouts that we performed, the physical work bouts, lasted 10 hours, but the shifts themselves, when you add the cognitive tasks or the mental tasks that Sally's going to talk about, actually comprise a 12-hour shift. So thanks for asking that question.
Okay, so we'll hear more about that soon. Angela has also asked a question. Can this be maintained over a shift length of 5 days? So I've gathered that she's looking now at not just how does this last after a couple of days, but if we do have a bushfire event that's extended over a long period of time, do you start to see other effects then?
It's a good question. We don't know enough about sustained performance. Our friends in the military would say that shortened sleep alone can be sustained over this type of time frame, but the research in a fire setting with the type of environment our firefighters face just hasn't been looked at. So I'm sorry, Angela, I can't answer that question at this time.
But I think that the research that you performed is the basis that research like that could build on. Is that right?
Tanya, we hope so. Every researcher hopes that their program of work sets up more questions and a bigger platform of research. So we hope that that's the case here too.
David has asked, were electrolytes provided or just water?
David, we actually consulted with all the agencies and got a mix of electrolyte, carbohydrates and water for the firefighters to choose from, and firefighters chose their own mix of water, carbohydrates and electrolytes across their shifts.
Does that reflect what would happen in normal practice?
Yes, it does. We've previously done work on the fireground, and there's considerable variation in a group of firefighters about their taste preferences, from people who only want to drink water to those that have a sweeter, more electrolyte-laden mix in their fluid provision.
Actually, that leads nicely to a question that Nathan had sent through before the event. How critical was the input of fire agencies in the design of the simulation?
Thanks, it's a great question. We couldn't do this work without our relationships inside the agency, fostered through the Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre. I think at every stage of the development process, we showed videos, we asked for volunteers to act as pilot test subjects to refine, so that when the work was finally undertaken, we had real confidence that any results could be transferred. So it was an integral part of our project, a real partnership.
Look, I think that's all we've got time for. We might address some of the other questions that have come through with later speakers, but thank you for your presentation, Brad. We'll now move on to our second research presenter, which is Professor Sally Ferguson from Appleton Institute at CQ Queensland. Now, she will be presenting on the operational readiness of rural firefighters during bushfire suppression. So she worked with Brad on his research as well. And again, we do encourage you to send through your questions. Sally, I'll get you to take it away.
Thanks, Tanya. Yeah, this was a joint project with the Appleton Institute down in Adelaide, part of Central Queensland University and Deakin University. And I'm going to talk about the findings from the cognitive task battery, as well as what we saw in the self-rating assessment. Now, as Brad's talked about, we know a lot about cognitive changes that occur when people don't get enough sleep or if they have been awake for long periods of time. But the stuff that we do know has largely come from laboratory-based studies where we purposely keep people very still. So we try to control the amount of activity that people can engage in the laboratory while we're testing cognitive functions. So for all intents and purposes, we keep them very still, which of course is very different to what is going on the fire ground and in other physically demanding industries. So very few studies have looked at cognitive performance when people are also doing physical activity. And of course, we're also interested in what happens when heat is added to the equation of sleep restriction. Now, it should be said really that we're drawing a slightly artificial line between physical tasks and cognitive tasks, because our rural firefighters are obviously doing anything that our rural firefighters are doing involves both cognitive and physical elements. But this is the way that we're talking about it at the moment, and we can certainly talk about the sorts of tasks that are involved in firefighting, hand-eye coordination, stepping down off a truck, through to putting a helmet on, involves both cognitive and physical elements. So what we are, so now just to talk about our research outcomes. As we've already hinted at, some cognitive functions were impaired with shortened sleep opportunities. So our participants either had 8-hour sleep opportunities or 4-hour sleep opportunities over the series of days with a simulation. Now that means, of course, that they got less sleep than that. And they, in that cognitive task batteries, they did some very simple tasks like vigilance, reaction time and hand-eye coordination, and some slightly more complex tasks such as memory and logical reasoning tasks. And what we saw from in our firefighters was that the higher order tasks, so the more complex ones, displayed time on task effects. So across the day, performance was degraded, but this was not affected by whether they were in the sleep restriction condition or the heat condition. In contrast, our simple tasks, the reaction time and hand-eye coordination, were affected by the conditions that the firefighters experienced, and we found that the awake conditions were worse for performance than the other conditions. And interestingly here, we found that heat did not make things worse for our simple cognitive tasks. And now moving on to the self-assessment. We did two things here. We asked firefighters about their fatigue level, and we also asked them about how they thought they were going to perform and then how they did perform their cognitive tasks. So in terms of the fatigue rating that our firefighters gave us, their responses correlated very well with performance across each of the consecutive days of restricted sleep and increased temperatures. So their fatigue rating, I feel very fatigued or I don't feel fatigued at all, matched very well with their performance findings. In contrast, however, when we asked them about how well they were going to perform and how well they did perform before and after the cognitive task batteries, while they did know that their performance was getting worse with elevated levels of fatigue, they overestimated the degree to which that performance was changing. So as performance got worse, the firefighters underestimated how bad things were actually getting. And I think I don't want to be correcting Tanya here, but at the start she said that our cognitive findings were unexpected. I don't know that they were necessarily unexpected, but it is true to say that our firefighters were not expecting that the performance was degrading to the degree that it was in the awake and hot condition. Now, just to summarise, I guess, these top 4 research outcomes, these have implications for the way that fatigue-related risk is assessed and managed for our rural firefighters. Certainly self-assessment on the fire ground is a critical element of the equation if we're assessing and managing fatigue-related risk. But our data suggests that self-assessment is not going to be sufficient and that other bits of information are really required in order to make those decisions. Things like the amount of sleep people have had, how long they've been awake, the time of day, and what work they're actually doing. And I think it's been interesting in this study that we found that people were able to say they were getting fatigued to the level that would correlate with the objective performance, but weren't assessing their performance to the same degree. Now, we do wonder whether the assessments of fatigue are based on what they knew about the condition that they were in. So, of course, they knew how much sleep they were getting or weren't getting, as the case may be. So that bit of information is, we think, quite important. And as a sleep scientist, of course, the other thing that we were interested in was what happened to sleep in the higher temperatures. So this is interesting because what we found was total sleep time wasn't affected. So the amount of sleep that people got in each condition was the same, but in the higher temperatures, the sleep patterns were changed. So when we look at the sleep architecture and what's going on with different stages, our deep sleep and our REM sleep, there were some changes going on there, which suggests that under certain conditions, higher temperatures, people's sleep might be affected without them realising it. They wouldn't even be able to realise it. So that's something also for agencies to think about in terms of managing fatigue-related risk. And I'll leave it there, Tanya.
Thank you, Sally, and thanks for picking up on my misunderstanding earlier. We have a question that Martin has sent through. Was the study benchmarked against common firefighting duties? Is there scope to include specialist capability?
Well, it looks like Brad has answered that question. The physical tasks, I'll read it out. The physical tasks were based on common, in brackets, non-specialist, physically demanding tasks that are done by rural firefighters on the fire ground. And as Brad says, looking at more specialist tasks is one of the obvious next steps.
So we have the basis for future research.
Yeah, I think we use the most frequent and the most demanding and the most something else task in this for this simulation.
Yeah. We have Loriana has sent through a question earlier. Did the study include age as a contributing factor?
Oh, that's a great question. So what we did was, in this particular part of the operational readiness study, so the ASH simulation, we recruited a representative population of rural firefighters. So out of the 91 firefighters that we had, our age range was 18 to 65. So we really did get a broad snapshot of demographics in the fire ground, and what we've done, in the fire agency, and what we have done with our analysis is age matched our controls, for example, our controls with our heat group or our controls with our awake group. So we haven't actually gone into looking at specific contributions of age, but we have controlled for it where we've been able to. It is something that we could have a look at in our future analysis.
And we have one more question that's come through, our last one with Sally for now. Anthony has asked, did core temperatures of individuals affect the quality of sleep and or cognition?
That is a great question. We do have that data, and one of our PhD students at the moment is about to launch into looking at specifically core body temperature and sleep outcomes.
Excellent. So watch this space.
Yep.
We'll leave it there. Thank you, Sally, for your presentation and for your answering questions. We'll now move on to our third research presentation, which comes from Dr. Michelle Short from the University of South Australia. Michelle is going to present on firefighter health and safety. And again, we do encourage you to send through your questions through that chat box. Take it away, Michelle.
Okay, thanks, Tanya. So the work I'm presenting today really arose from an industry-identified need to explore alternatives to day and night shift rosters for incident management teams. And specifically, there was an interest in looking at additional ways to schedule teams during catastrophic bushfire events to provide 24-hour coverage where you would only have 2 teams of workers to meet that need. So traditional 12-hour day and night shift rosters certainly can be problematic because both the day and the night shift teams face heightened fatigue risk due to prolonged periods of wakefulness, and the night shift also faces the additional challenge of trying to work at night when your body is optimally primed to be asleep, and then trying to sleep in the day when your body is optimally primed to be awake. And we know that these 2 factors are among the largest predictors of workplace accidents and incidents. So we know that some industries have already implemented these shorter and more frequent shifts to address these risk factors. For example, these would include split sleep schedules, such as the 6-hour on, 6-hour off schedules that are implemented in the maritime industry, and particularly among watchkeepers. And there's also 8-hour on, 8-hour off shifts, which are used in longer haul train drivers. And the potential benefit of these shifts are that they limit that time on shift fatigue by not having really long shift lengths. And while there's still night work, because these industries need 24-hour coverage as well, the night work isn't being compounded by long shifts, and also all of the workers get at least some opportunities to sleep during the night. So what we were interested in doing to have a look at this is to bring people into the lab. It was really a sort of proof of concept research project, and they spent 9 consecutive days and 8 nights. This included 2 baseline nights where they slept at night and performed simulated work during the day. Then they had 4 experimental days during which they were on one of our rosters, so either a 6-hour on, 6-hour off roster or an 8-hour on, 8-hour off split roster. And then this was followed by 2 recovery days and nights to see how well people were able to recover and return back to sort of a normal, you know, waking during the day, sleeping at night pattern. So every 2 hours during wake, we tested participants on their cognitive performance on a range of measures, which included things like attention, reaction time, cognitive throughput, and also alertness. And at night, or during the day, for many of them, sleep was monitored using polysomnography. So this is an objective measure of their sleep. Okay, so what do we find? Well, when we had a look at the ability to sustain attention, we found that shift work performance on these split shifts was pretty much equivalent to what people were able to do during the day at baseline, so that there wasn't a significant decline overall during the split shift. But while this daily average performance was maintained, we certainly still noticed time of day effects. So we noticed that people still had greater deficits of performance in the early morning following on from a night shift, which is what we would expect to find. In terms of how people felt while they were doing these split shifts, on average their alertness was slightly less during split shifts when compared to their normal daytime alertness. However, this was still relatively high, so on average people said that they felt rather alert. So there wasn't really significant deficits, And the other thing that I think is important to note that is that alertness change plateaued. So going from being awake during the day, sleeping at night, to then working split shifts was associated with a bit of a dampening of alertness, but then that was maintained at a consistent level across days. So the deficits didn't accumulate over that time. And again, there was a time of day effect with worse alertness during the early hours of the morning. So we actually noticed many more differences when we looked at the sleep. So while performance and alertness tended to be maintained, sleep certainly took a hit when we put people onto these split shifts. On average, people obtained less sleep during the split sleep schedules, and this seemed to be largely due to two factors. So first of all, because obviously they're needing to initiate sleep more often during split sleep or split shift schedules, and also their ability to maintain sleep was affected. So there was a little bit more wakefulness during the sleep period during split shift. And this is just likely to be, again, because of the difficulties that are faced when you're trying to sleep at times that really aren't fitting in with what your body clock's wanting you to do. And when we compared the 6-hour split shifts with the 8-hour split shifts, we found that people tended to get more sleep on the 6-hour shift, which indicates that that shift might have a little bit more promise in terms of operational promise, particularly as we move into situations in which sleep gets a little bit more truncated. So in summary, these results suggest that there was little cumulative cost to sustain attention across days of split shifts. Participants were able to maintain performance across the schedule in ways that were similar to their baseline performance, which was a daytime performance. And while alertness was lower, again, this didn't accumulate. It plateaued across shift days and it still remains relatively high. So moving forward, I think it'll be really beneficial to extend this research and actually examine the effect of these split shifts under conditions of more restricted sleep periods, which is consistent with the experience of incident management teams, and also to move into more field-based trials. Thank you. Back to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Michelle. We'll have two questions really quickly. We've had, Kathy sent through a question earlier. Did you look at night shift of, say, 19 hours compared to non-night shift people who normally do not work night shift?
We certainly didn't have any 19-hour shifts. And in particular, we were interested in being able to compare how people were able to perform during split sleep or split shift schedules with their optimal performance. And we certainly know that after a 19-hour shift, nobody's at their optimal level of performance. And if anything, we're sort of looking at to do the opposite and say, we know without a doubt that after 19 hours of continuous time on shift, that people are likely to have really significant deficits. What can we do to minimise the risk of that? So we actually quite dramatically shortened shifts in order to address that.
Okay, good. And Mark also sent through a question earlier asking, did you come up with a recommendation on the optimal shift length?
Great. Yeah, no, look, these are really good questions. In terms of optimal shift length, certainly when people have looked at a lot of the shift work literature worldwide and really sort of pulled all of those results and said, what can we find out about what works, what doesn't, and what, where these risks lie, they found that shift lengths up to about 8 hours seem to be okay, but then as soon as you extend beyond that 8 hours, that's when that increased risk of accidents and incidents and injuries and things like that all start to increase as soon as we go beyond 8 hours.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. And we'll leave the questions there. Thank you for your presentation also. Kathy, I note the question that you sent through. It's an excellent question and one that's quite focused on operational considerations, so we're going to save that one for later when we have Robyn, our lead end user, to answer that one. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our fourth and final research presentation. We're now going to hear from Dr. Fabienne Reisen from CSIRO. She's going to present on smoke impacts, and again we encourage you to send through your questions for Fabienne. Take it away.
Thank you, Tanya. So I just briefly go over sort of how can smoke affect you. We've heard just in the previous slide how the heat and fatigue could affect you. And you can see within this table that some of the symptoms that you can do due to some of the components that are in the smoke, they can also lead to some of the symptoms that you might observe when you're fatigued or when you're working in hot conditions. So some of them would be decreased exercise and work capacity, increased reaction time. You're not as able as well to perform different tasks. You might fatigue and headaches and dizziness are also some of the smoke components symptoms that you could have if you're exposed to some of the higher levels. And then, of course, you have some of the other smoke components that could be linked to respiratory or eye irritation, and also potentially for those people with pre-existing heart conditions, aggravate any of the heart conditions and increase the risk of heart attack. So how do we actually assess exposure? So we're interested to determine actually whether the exposure that people, firefighters, are exposed to, are they high enough to cause adverse health effects. So what we're doing is looking at the exposures and compare them against current occupational exposure standards. So this current research, the way we approached it, we want to get an idea in structure, in fires at the interface, what sort of emissions do we look at, and what are the hazardous components in the smoke. Once these ones are emitted, how do they disperse in the atmosphere, and how do they impact on firefighters that work at 50 up to maybe 200, 300 meters downwind. So from literature data and some additional experimental data, we determined some of the toxic components that are emitted from burning different types of materials that you can typically find in structures and houses. So what we find is that you have higher emission yields from polymeric materials such as polyurethane foam, polystyrene, and also you get some additionally air toxics that are emitted from burning materials that you typically wouldn't see if you just burn vegetation. So some of those ones would be hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen fluoride, especially emitted from burning PVC. You get styrene, and you also get isocyanides, which are primarily emitted from polyurethane foam and are strong irritants. So what did we do next? So Michael Borges has worked with me on this project, and he's developed a new dispersion model that's based on puff-generated plumes. So what the model is doing is we're looking at point source emissions to, in the immediate term, determine what is the hazardous nature of the chemicals in the smoke plume. We then correlate these ones with the winds as the source of emissions to assess how do the winds influence exposures downwind. The model is actually what it provides is a high time resolution. So it enables us to assess peak concentration exposures on a short time frame. So instead of just averaging exposures over several hours or days, we actually can get exposure estimates over 1 minute or 15 minutes. And these ones we can then compare against the occupation exposure standards for acute toxicity, which are based on peak exposures over 1 minute periods of time, and also short-term exposure limits over 15 minutes time period. The other thing that the model is going to provide too is to determine how likely and often exposures exceed safe levels. So in all the exposure estimates will enable us to determine how high concentrations are, how frequently these high peaks are occurring, and for how long people are exposed to high concentrations. So the exposure estimates, we know that both the magnitude and frequency of the exposures depend on several factors. One on the major one is, of course, how far downwind you are. The closer you are to the source, the higher your exposure to chemical components. So the further you move away, you're reducing your average and peak exposures. You also, if you're looking at a plume, the further you move away from the plume center line, we also have more clean air getting entrained into the smoke plume, so you have reduced exposures at the edge of the plume.
At the edge of your plume, you can still have short-term concentrations that are still elevated, but they are more intermittent, which means that you have more time periods of clean air episodes, and so you can reduce your overall exposures. In terms of wind speed, if you're looking at being downwind, increased exposures are observed at higher wind speed. This is primarily due to the fact that the higher the wind speed, the quicker the smoke is going to be dispersed downwind, and less clean air is entrained into the smoke plume. The other thing is too that you don't necessarily have one single structure burning, but you generally at the urban interface you have several homes that could burn in addition to vegetation and sheds. So you have an amount of merging plumes. So if they merge together and you downwind of multiple plumes, you have the additive effect from being exposed to 2 or 3 plumes at the same time. So what are the major research outcomes from this study? So we actually were able to get an improved assessment of the toxic emissions from burning materials, and primarily focusing on additional air toxics that are emitted, which could both be causing asphyxiation or majority of them impacting on the respiratory tract and also on the central nervous system. We also observed higher emission yields when burning polymeric materials. The new dispersion technique that was developed allowed us to translate the emission data into exposure concentrations downwind, and also allowed us to, as I mentioned before, to get those peak exposures rather than get averaged exposures. We also have shown that close to the source, at about 50 meters, there's no safe approach without protection, and this is primarily due to the fact that we can observe quite high concentration of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide, which are both asphyxiants, which can severely impact firefighters' ability to react as they would without being exposed to smoke. And so it could potentially cause major hazards. The only way to protect is either to move away from the smoke or wear proper breathing apparatus. Further away from the smoke, at about 100 to 150 meters, we definitely have concentrations of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide subsiding. But we still can have high peak exposures, but they are more intermittent. The amount of irritants and pollutants that are still in the smoke, they can still pose a potential health and safety risk to firefighters. The research will hopefully inform firefighters and emergency service workers of the potential risks that they can face while fighting fires in the rural urban interface. And we also hope that some of the outcomes from this research can also help in guiding communities to give them a better understanding of the potential health hazards that they can be exposed to when doing a bushfire and trying to defend their property. Okay, and I'll leave it at that. Back to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Fabienne. We've had a question come through from Robyn asking, how do wind speed and direction variations near the smoke source affect the firefighter's safety?
In terms, I can only respond to it in terms of smoke exposures, in terms of fire behaviour and how dangerous conditions might be to fight the fire. I'm not in a really good position to answer that. But in terms of exposures, as I mentioned before, the higher wind speed brings the smoke much quicker downwind, so we have less time to sort of mix with clean air. So usually, in general, we would observe higher exposures under higher wind conditions.
Kathy also sent through a question earlier before the forum started asking, with regard to masks and smoke, is a PS2 enough or is there something better for a bushfire situation? Also, is a wet nappy enough?
Very good questions that have been asked quite frequently. So we personally haven't looked at the efficiency of the different masks, but looking at sort of the components that are in the smoke, P2 masks are able to filter out some of the fine particles that make up the major component of the health hazard from the smoke. But also if it has additional filter for organic compounds, that would be even better because we have some of those ones that would be severe irritants. Should be kept in mind that those filters, they do not filter out carbon monoxide or hydrogen cyanide, so having personal monitors might be really useful to alert firefighters of really high levels.
Yes, that was going to be my next question if you hadn't mentioned it, the carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. So yes, the knowledge of having those alerts is very important. Look, we'll leave the questions there. Thank you, Fabienne, for your research presentation and for your answers as well. Before we move on to our lead end user, we're going to have a quick poll to see how you might envisage using the research that you've heard presented today. So the poll will come up on screen now. Now you can click more than one option, and we're not asking you to make a commitment, just to give us a sense of how you feel you could use what you've heard today. So will you, for example, share and discuss this with colleagues and stakeholders? Would you use the findings to inform policy and practice in your organisation? Collaborate with other agencies and organisations? Or learn more about how you can apply this work to your role? And we'll leave that there. Yes, I think that reflects a good combination of using these resources both internally within the organisation and externally collaborating with others. So that's a good thing for us to see. We'll now introduce our lead end user, which is Robyn Pearce. She's from Tasmania Fire Service. Robyn is going to talk a little bit when she comes on screen about how she'll use this research and things that she feels that other lead end users could learn from this research. Hello, Robyn. So first off, Robyn, do you have any comments to make on those poll findings? Right, we're not. Can I check that you're not muted?
Is that better now?
That's better. There you go. I'll get you to repeat what you've just said.
Yes, thank you. It's wonderful that people are looking at discussing the research findings with their colleagues. We know that it's those water cooler discussions which is often what will trigger change to actually happen within an agency. And getting engaged with the actual changes on the ground through the policy making will also make sure that we're getting very practical outcomes from the research.
So what changes do you think need to occur within fire and emergency services and the management sector to take up these findings into policy and practice?
I guess that needs to happen at a number of levels. Firstly, at an industry level, we need to be considering across Australasia what the research is telling us and how we can look at adopting that, and that is happening through the AFAC group. The second part of it is within agencies really looking at what our mechanisms are for adopting research. Do we have good systems in place where the research can be considered and built into our doctrine and learning systems?
I guess too, part of the challenge with that is bridging the theoretical with the practical. It actually relates to a question that Kathy had sent through earlier. The question that she asked was, in the dark, it can be hazardous to direct firefighters on to where to go. So it is about having more teams but letting them sleep on the fire ground. Do you have any comments to make on that?
From an industry perspective, when we were looking at the research around short and shift length, we were really considering that in an incident management team context, which is more static and office-based rather than a field context. And that consideration was given just purely because of some of those logistical issues, recognising the distance that we need to travel, often to where our firefighting operations are, as well as the logistics of the hazards of the fire ground and the handover. To consider what we might do on a fire ground level is completely different to the incident management team environment.
Actually, there was a little bit of dialogue happening in the chat box between Michelle, one of our researchers, and one of the audience members, Peter. I'll just read out the tail end of the comment because I think it's something that you might like to comment on too. Peter has said pending role tasking at handovers can be simple and static or extremely complex and fluid. Obviously, a team's ability to conduct and sequence efficient briefing is an important variable in any further testing, perhaps measured by time and correct planning and operational outputs. Do you have any comments to make on that in general terms?
I think it's really important that agencies have in place good systems, and most agencies do, around how to conduct briefings and debriefings and transmission of incident action plans. What we need to do is to make sure that what we learn from our research is actually built into those systems and more tools created that will assist them to be used on the fire ground. We've got to find that nice balance between what the research is telling us and the operational practicality, and do it in a way that's going to look after the safety of our people as well as the community.
Thank you, Robyn. That's all I've got time for, so we'll leave the questions and answers there. Thank you, Robyn. We'll now revisit the first poll that we had earlier on in the forum to see how our learnings might have changed during today's presentation. So that first poll will now come back up on screen. How much do you think you understand about fire ground stresses on firefighters, such as smoke, sleep disruption and heat? And we'll give it a few seconds more. And we'll leave it there. Yes, there seems to be more people saying that they know a fair bit and a lot, which is good to see. We hope you've learned something today. And so it's good to see that understanding of the research starting to filter through. Well, that's just about all we've got time for now, but I will bring Robyn back on very quickly to give you a wrap-up take-home message. Robyn, do you want to give us some summing up thoughts?
Thank you, Tanya. My thought to leave you would be based upon that last poll. Please do make sure that you engage within your agency and within the industry on looking at ways that we can adopt this research into our practice. This information can only help to keep both our people and the community safer.
Excellent. Thank you, Robyn. And that's all we've got time for in today's forum. It brings today's forum to a close. I'd now like to thank our presenters today, the researchers Brad, Sally, Michelle, Fabienne, and also our lead end user Robyn, for their insights and their presentations. And of course, thank you to you, the audience, for your participation and your questions and involvement. Now, we do encourage you to visit the website at www.bushfirecrc, where in the coming days we will make today's presentation available. And again, if you do feel that there's a colleague or friend who might have benefited from hearing about today's research presentations, do encourage them to view that online at a later date. There's also related reports and fire notes that are available on the website as well. Now, we do have a brief exit survey. We'd really appreciate it if people could take the time to fill that out and provide feedback so that we can improve future forums and other research translation. Our next forum webinar will be Beyond the Incident, and that will explore how multi-agency emergency management coordination at regional and state levels could be improved in order to reduce emergency consequences onto communities. And this will take place on Monday, the 29th of September. Keep an eye on the Bushfire CRC website for details, or leave a comment in the exit survey if you'd like to be included in the mailing list for future online forums. Now, on behalf of the Bushfire CRC Research to Drive Change project and its partners, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.